In 1820, a story was published, a story that became so popular that it has never since gone out of print. Called The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, it has often been described as America's first ghost story. And today it drives so much tourism that it has developed what the New York Times describes as its own industrial complex. And while it wasn't specifically set on October 31st, it is perhaps the story that most represents Halloween. But Irving managed to work quite a lot of history into his ghost story, history that deserves to be remembered. It's very likely that you've already read the story, or if you haven't, it's only 5 pages long and available free online. Two, you might have seen one or more of the more than a dozen adaptations for film or television listed on Wikipedia, or encountered it in some other form, from plays to songs to graphic novels to a 2013 adaptation involving Smurfs. The popularity of the story can be seen in the industry it today supports. The New York Times wrote in 2019, the great jack-o'-lantern blaze, held annually in Croton-on-Hudson, New York, is the vivid orange jewel in the crown of the Sleepy Hollow region's thriving Halloween industry, which would not exist if not for the Washington Irving short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In October, approximately 100,000 tourists descend on the Westchester County village of 10,000, where a schoolteacher named Ichabod Crane was tormented by the Headless Horseman. And that industry itself illustrates two contradictory facts. One, that the story is grounded in history, set in real places and a real time, and second, that it is difficult to separate the reality behind the legend when the legend sells so well. That begins with the book, or rather compilation of short stories themselves, written, so the story goes, by one Geoffrey Crayon. Crayon is more than the author. His personality is spread throughout the set of 34 essays that make up the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Gentleman, that were originally published in serial form beginning in 1819. But, of course, there was no Geoffrey Crayon. The book was written by Washington Irving, and it's difficult to tell if Geoffrey Crayon is a character or merely a pen name. Is Geoffrey Crayon really Washington Irving, or Washington Irving's creation? If so, he isn't the only one. While the sketchbook earned Irving an international reputation, it was not his first successful work, that being The History of New York, from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty. Published in 1809, the book purports to be a history, written by a historian named Diedrich Knickerbocker. But of course there was no Diedrich Knickerbocker. The book was written by Washington Irving, and is less a history than a collection of satirical essays. And as with Geoffrey Crayon, Knickerbocker is something more than a pseudonym, but still undeniably at least a reflection of Irving himself. But Knickerbocker was also more than a pseudonym because Irving had a friend named Knickerbocker, Herman Knickerbocker of the New York upstate Knickerbocker clan. How much of Diedrich Knickerbocker was Herman Knickerbocker, and how much of Diedrich Knickerbocker was Washington Irving? Well, it's hard to tell, but purportedly he once introduced his friend Herman to President James Madison as my cousin Diedrich Knickerbocker, the great historian of New York. And if you're wondering, yes, it was because of the character that the term Knickerbocker, which referred to a New Yorker who could trace his or her ancestry back to the original Dutch settlers, came to be synonymous with New Yorkers, and is the genesis of the abbreviated term knickers, referring to the baggy kneed pants that were popular with early Dutch settlers in New York and later became popular as athletic uniforms, and indirectly and weirdly as a slang term in the UK for women's underwear, as well as, according to NBA.com, the name of the city's professional basketball team. To add another layer, the fictional Geoffrey Crayon is, for the most part, quoting fictional Diedrich Knickerbocker. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was first published as part of the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon in March of 1820. The title includes the note, found among the papers of the late Diedrich Knickerbocker. That is, one pseudonym of Washington Irving seems to have cribbed the story from another pseudonym of Washington Irving. Literary scholars speculate that Irving used these pen names because it allowed him to weave in his famous sense of irony, though even Irving probably could not have predicted the irony that the New York professional basketball team would be, pardon the pun, sharing a nickname with women's underwear. But in the present discussion, it means that it can be difficult to determine what is history and what is fantasy in a story in which a fictional author reads from a fictional sketchbook from a fictionally deceased fictional historian. For example, the eponymous setting of the story, the timely hamlet of Sleepy Hollow, a place where a drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land, is a real town, or rather village, in the town of Mount Pleasant in Westchester County, New York. You can go there today and visit its cemetery where Washington Irving himself is buried. Irving first spent time there in 1798, 8 years after the setting of the fictional story, at the age of 15, his family traveling to avoid an outbreak of yellow fever in the city. The church, an integral part of the story, is also there, but again, kind of sorta. The original name by Dutch settlers seems to have been Slappers Haven or Sleepers Haven, which is likely where the name Sleepy Hollow originates, although the town doesn't seem to have officially borne that name. Instead, it was called Philipsburg, named after a Dutch settler who owned the land in the area. Bore that name on maps into the 19th century, and that is likely the name that was used when Irving first visited. And when the town was incorporated in 1874, it used the name North Terrytown as a way to capitalize on the industrial success of the nearby town, which is itself mentioned in the story. It wasn't until 1996 that the village changed its name officially to Sleepy Hollow in order to capitalize on the tourist opportunity offered by Irving's story. So while Irving set his story in a real place, the place seems to have been rewritten around the story. But while the village seems to have taken the name, it might be the other way around for the protagonist, Ichabod Crane, because there was in fact a real Ichabod Crane, a contemporary of Washington Irving. Ichabod Bennett Crane was a Marine Corps officer who served aboard the frigate United States under Stephen Decatur. Crane and Irving served at the same time at Fort Pike in Sackett's Harbor, New York during the War of 1812. Irving is an aide-de-camp to Daniel Tompkins, governor of New York and commander of the Federal Military District, while Crane was an artillery captain in the Marines. Did Irving get the name for this character from the Marine officer? Well, the problem, historian Peter Malya wrote in the New York Times in 2002, is that neither man left a record of meeting the other. Irving scholar Elizabeth Bradley concurred, telling the Times that there was no evidence of an encounter in either the Life and Letters of Washington Irving, edited by Irving's nephew Pierre, or in two recent biographies of Irving. Still, Malya notes, but Irving was famous for borrowing the names of those he knew for his storytelling. While Captain Crane was stationed in Rhode Island after the war, Irving may have borrowed his name for the gangly, superstitious schoolteacher in the legend of Sleepy Hollow and probably had a good laugh doing it. We simply don't know that Irving took the name from the Marine officer that we can't prove he actually met, although it seems quite the coincidence if he didn't. Although Bradley told the Times, I can say that Irving was fond of manufacturing Yankee names. And in any case, Malya notes that the real Crane was far from the gangly schoolteacher that Irving portrayed in the tale. And whether related to the character or not, Malya writes that the fact that his fictitious namesake was renowned may have even helped Crane's military career. Served in many important posts and reached the rank of colonel. So there was historically an Ichabod Crane, and we don't know if Irving got the name from him, but he wasn't a gangly schoolteacher. But was the schoolteacher a real person? Irving gave a less than flattering description of Ichabod Crane. He was tall but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long sniped nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. That seems an uncharitable description of Jesse Merwin, a rural schoolmaster in upstate New York, who was a personal friend of both Washington Irving and Martin Van Buren. The William J. Pomeroy Foundation explains the personage seems to resemble the schoolmaster of Kinderhook School in Kinderhook, New York, Jesse Merwin. Merwin and Irving reportedly became friends about 1809 when Irving was staying in Kinderhook, and the two continued to correspond for decades afterwards. The website of Milford, Connecticut Living Magazine explains the similarities. A young man who, like his protagonist, had left his home in Connecticut to teach the descendants of Dutch settlers in a one-room schoolhouse in New York. It was this man, Jesse Merwin of Milford, who would inspire Washington Irving to write one of America's most famous and enduring tales. But Merwin is not the only contender. An 1894 edition of the New York Times reported on the dedication of a monument to Revolutionary War veterans in Tarrytown. Included on the list is Lieutenant Samuel Youngs. The paper writes, his father, Joseph Youngs, was the proprietor of the Youngs House, a famous hostelry in the district until it was burned in 1780. It is claimed by many that Youngs is the original from whom Irving drew his character Ichabod Crane. Bradley told the Times, several 19th century school teachers are held up as the model for the character of Ichabod Crane, and it's unclear what exactly Irving took from Merwin or Youngs or someone else. But again, fiction has driven history, the Times notes. Kinderhook, the Columbia County where Mr. Merwin taught, has renamed an extant 19th century one-room schoolhouse the Ichabod Crane Schoolhouse, the better to capitalize on the Irving association. On the monument with Lieutenant Youngs is Major Jacob von Tassel. That is interesting because, of course, in the story, Ichabod Crane competes for the affection of Katrina Van Tassel. In fact, Van Tassel was a common name. The blog Book Snob explains Van Tassel was the equivalent of the surname Smith in the area. And in fact, Irving knew some Van Tassels, and many think that he knew a particular Van Tassel. As the Greenberg Public Library in nearby Elmsford writes, historians believe Katrina Van Tassel was based on the vivacious Eleanor Laney Van Tassel Brush, but Irving must have thought that Eleanor's aunt's name was more befitting of a beautiful young girl, because he seems to have borrowed Katrina Ecker Van Tassel's first name. Irving would have been quite familiar with the Van Tassel family. There are records of his sister boarding at the family tavern. Thus, the coquettish center of a love triangle might have been real in both person and name, or, as with Ichabod Crane, may have derived from a combination of acquaintances. And, the library notes, it's not likely coincidence that buried in the same cemetery with Washington Irving is a blacksmith, just like the mischievous character who had tormented poor Ichabod, named Abraham Martling. Martling would have been blacksmith both when Irving visited and in 1790 when the story was supposed to occur. His entry on Find a Grave reads, he was the model for the character of Brom Bones in the book The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. And if these characters were based on real people, what about the most terrifying? The ghost himself, the Headless Horseman, whom Irving describes as the dominant spirit and commander-in-chief of all powers of the air, said by some to be a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War. Having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of the battle in nightly quest of his head. Hessians were German mercenaries. Coffee or Die magazine explains, during the American Revolution, Britain relied heavily on German auxiliary forces, known as Hessians, to bolster its army. Renowned for their discipline and martial prowess, the Hessians were viewed by their American foes as bloodthirsty marauders who killed for money. So Hessians were certainly real and frightening and would have been recalled well in the area, but a headless one buried in the churchyard? Well, if you visit the Old Dutch Cemetery in Sleepy Hollow today, you'll likely hear the story of how a headless Hessian is buried in an unmarked grave. The Hessian was said to have protected a little girl from British soldiers, and when the body of a Hessian was found with no head, they assumed it was him and allowed him to be buried in the churchyard, but without a marker. But the problem is this story is clearly told as part of the Sleepy Hollow industrial complex for tourists, and there's no sound evidence that proves that the story predated Irving or wasn't created just as a response to his story. But there was, in fact, a headless Hessian, as the Journal of American General William Heath recorded, in the 1776 Battle of White Plains, just a few miles from Tarrytown. A shot from the American cannon at this place took off the head of a Hessian artilleryman. The journal was published in 1798, and Irving may well have been familiar with it. Today there is a marker on the spot, but it was placed after the story was published and mentions the legend of Sleepy Hollow on the marker. And there is another bit of history. Crane, in his frightening ride at night, comes upon a large tree. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant above all the other trees of the neighborhood and formed a kind of landmark. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for ordinary trees, twisted down almost to the earth and rising again into the air. It was connected with the tragic story of the unfortunate Andre, who had been taken prisoner hard by and was universally known by the name of Major Andre's Tree. John Andre was, of course, a real person, a British Army major and adjutant general and chief of spy operations in America. In 1780, he conspired with Benedict Arnold to steal the plans for the defenses at West Point, but was captured by 3 Americans who discovered the plans hidden in his stockings. The discovery revealed Arnold's treachery and saved West Point, and Major Andre was sentenced to hang. Today there's no tree, but a marker at the site where Andre was captured, but Catherine Egner Gruber, special exhibition curator for the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, notes, James Kirk Paulding, in his 1828 New York travelogue, The New Mirror for Travelers, wrote of a tree 111 feet and a half high, the limbs projecting on either side more than 80 feet from the trunk, which was then 10 paces around. And according to Paulding, local tradition held that it was under this very tree where patriots first apprehended and searched Major John Andre. Not only was the tree real, but as Andre was a gallant gentleman and many were dismayed at his execution, perhaps Gruber writes, the town itself is haunted by the memory of an executed British spy, perpetuated by the looming presence of a fearful tree. There is a lot of history and a lot of irony in the legend of Sleepy Hollow, and given that Irving was a satirist, it's perhaps not a surprise that he based his story on real events and real people that in a perhaps ironically or satirically exaggerated way represent a nearly forgotten era in American history. Even the ghostly setting might have been real. Irving biographer Brian Jones wrote in 2016 that for Irving there was no god in this region, but there were plenty of goblins and ogres, witches and pirates. where people shared local legends and told ghost stories that sent shivers up his spine. But that leads us to perhaps the strangest part of America's first ghost story. Does it really include a ghost? Irving leaves the story open-ended so that you're never really sure if there was a headless horseman or if it was just a trick of the mischievous Brom Bones or a figment of the timid teacher's imagination. But one thing is certainly true in history. The story has sent shivers down millions of spines. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.